And you got to realize that putting things off just does nothing for us. It doesn't make any of our problems disappear. In fact, it makes some things worse. Can you imagine being diagnosed with cancer and just delaying treatment for an extended period of time? That just doesn't make sense. You find out you have a problem and you begin to deal with it. When it comes to your health, if you get diagnosed with something, you put it off, you're kind of playing roulette with your life. And as we think about this, I need us to wonder, what are some of the problems that you've been putting off? Maybe it's time that we bring some of those things to the forefront and see how God wants to work through them. So one, as people, as very fallen and broken people, we typically procrastinate. And two, we also tend to pass the buck. If you don't understand what this term means, we typically pass blame onto somebody else and act like it's just not our responsibility. We'll blame others. We'll say that it's really not our problem. We'll say that it's their fault. They got to deal with it. Where does it say it here? In verse 36, the apostles responded to Jesus after saying that it's late. He said, here's what we should do, Jesus. He's like, send the people away so that they could go to the surrounding countryside and villages and they can get their own lunches today. The apostles were like, hey, there's a lot of people here. Oh, why don't you tell them that we're going to take a little siesta? Lunch wasn't provided, unfortunately, but there's a village a couple miles this way. Go grab something to eat. This was their honest response. And we have this idea a lot of times with our problems where, if something's out of sight, it's also out of mind. They're probably thinking to themselves, we didn't ask these guys to join us, so they should find their own food. We procrastinate, we pass the buck, and we also worry. We worry, we fret, we get anxious, we stress out in a way that it is just paralyzing to us. Like I said, if you haven't heard it before, worrying is kind of like sitting in a rocking chair. It gives you something to do, but you really just get nowhere. You like that one? Cool, me too. What they say here is, shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? And in other versions, you'll say that it would take 8 months' wages to feed all these people one meal. He's like, is that really what you're asking us to do? He's like, we left our jobs. Some of us were fishermen. Some of us may have been other things, but we left those things and followed you, and we're flat broke. And you're asking us to come up with 8 months' wages worth of food to feed all these people for one meal. They're just thinking the logistics just don't make sense. And what's funny is we tend to get swept up in our worry and in the logistics more than we get swept up in who we're talking to. Think about that the apostles were trying to preach logistics to Jesus, our God, the guy who can turn stone to bread, the guy who's turned water to wine. He was more than capable of acting on this. He easily could have had manna rain down from heaven right there and then, but instead, they tried to explain to him why they shouldn't do anything. And typically when we worry, we forget who Jesus is and what he's capable of doing. We tend to get swept up in our own fretting as opposed to moving in our faith. So one of the questions that we're putting out for each and every one of us is, has God ever asked you to do something that just seemed well beyond your reach? What does he ask you to do that you honestly felt was just impossible, where you just didn't have enough time, enough energy, enough money, enough talent? And we start to wonder, why does he ask us to do things that are just impossible? And here's where we remember this first big point. How do we create room for God to work miracles? One, we see what's impossible in our lives, but we also remember that we're called to the impossible because he wants to stretch our faith. Know that you're being called to something hard, one, because he's trying to grow you, but two, he's trying to remind you in these areas that you need him. God doesn't call us to anything worthwhile that we don't need him in. Everything he calls us to, he's going to basically call us to these things that are suicide missions, that are destined for failure unless we seek his face and his hand in them. Because at the end of it, we'll be able to say that everything that was done was purely because of divine grace and mercy. We're not passing the buck, we are owning responsibility, but part of owning our responsibility to work is also knowing that God's power had to be the real power behind it. It's our responsibility, but it's his hand who works. So two, how does he turn a little into a lot? First, we identify that we have some unsolvable problems, and two, we want to give God what little we have. I'm going to read verse 38 again. It says, "And he said to them, 'How many loaves do you have? Go and see.' And when they found out, they said, 5 loaves and 2 fish. I need to wonder, why did Jesus do this? He asks, how many loaves do you have? Again, he could have just had food and manna rain down from heaven, but he was working through his apostles. And he asked, how many loaves do you have? And again, it reminds us that God starts with what little bit we have. John chapter 6, verse 6 says, Jesus asked this not only to test them, for he had already in mind what he was going to do. You got to wonder, Jesus probably didn't sweat this situation at all. He probably saw the need for this long before they ever did, and he already had a plan. So again, this helps inspire faith in such a way that he actually knows the answer that he's going to present to us before the problem even presents itself. It's really just going to be an issue of us in faith. Are we going to go to him with our problems? As we move forward, what we see is God works with what little we have, and also what we're being called to do is we're being called to put everything in the hands of Jesus. If we look at the account of this miracle in the book of John, Andrew found one young boy who brought a sacked lunch. And this one young boy, what did he have? He had 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. What we need to know is, I don't know why I didn't think about this when I was younger. We need to know that there's no way this young boy was the only person who brought lunch here. There's just no way. Because we also know that that when people were following Jesus, while he invited the poor and like no one else, he gave the poor and the disenfranchised a seat at the table where they could listen to him. It wasn't just him who listened. It wasn't just the poor who followed him. You got to know the rich people followed him as well. We also have an account of the rich young ruler who wanted to follow Jesus. So that case had to be true. There had to be some more well-off people following him. That being the case, well-off people probably brought lunch. But I guarantee you those guys hid their lunches underneath the blanket. They hid it underneath their tunics. So what we find is that while other people may have brought lunch, it was only this one young boy that was willing to offer what he had, and it wasn't much. And somehow, in the end of this story, this little kid ends up being this hero in this story because he gave a little offering. And again, it wasn't the quantity of what he brought. He brought a little, and God made a lot out of it. He brought a little, but it was a huge sacrifice. You picture this kid who decides to chase after Jesus and hear from him, and his mom on his way out is like, hey, take this basket, you're going to go hungry. And rather than feed himself, he volunteers and offers it to Jesus, not knowing if he's going to do anything great with it, but trusts and says, God, do with it as you will. It's all I have, but do with it as you will. And I imagine that other guys brought bigger lunches because they were grown men. It would have taken me like 3 times that much. But this little kid offered everything he had in this moment. And God worked something miraculous out of it. So in verse 41, it says that Jesus took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. He blessed the food and broke the loaves, and then he kept giving them to the disciples to set before the people. We need to know that God is going to use whatever you give him. And he has this awesome way of using ordinary people in extraordinary ways. And I believe that a lot of this whole church community thing has people second guessing what we have to bring. But we always encourage you, whatever it is that you have within you, offer it to the Lord and be blown away and just pleasantly surprised as to how he's going to use you. Because like we said, this was never about equal gifts. This was never about equal offerings, but this was about equal sacrifice. So what do we note? That this kind of giving that sparked this miracle, this little kid gave his lunch. One, he gave it willingly, where Matthew says that he volunteered his lunch. People didn't have to chase him around and say, hey, you're going to give this up. He volunteered his lunch. 2, he did it cheerfully in such a way that he didn't grumble or complain. This would have been real tough for me, and I'm assuming for you too. 3, he also gave it immediately, where as soon as the need presented itself, this kid stepped up to the plate without hesitation. And God moved through this action. And God moved through this kid's heart. So as we're trying to get ready and we're trying to create space for God to work miracles in our lives, 1, we want to see what are the impossible things in our lives that he has to work out. 2, we want you to give what little you have. We want you to put it in the hands of Jesus. And lastly, we want to expect God to multiply it. And I think this is actually kind of hard for me to come to grips with, because if you know me, you know that I am typically against this idea of treating God like some genie, and where we try to even offer him things in our lives as a way of him cashing in on it and giving us more in return. Where we say, God, here's my part. You got to do yours and kind of rain down on me some blessings. I am against that, where if in your heart you're just treating God like a slot machine, that is just not cool. But at the same time, God is consistent in such a way where when we give a little, he typically multiplies what we give. And in a way that while we may think that we want God to work in our lives, he takes our small offering and multiplies it for other people. So what happened in this story was they ate it all, they were all satisfied, and then they took up 12 baskets full of leftovers. This is after everybody was satisfied, after everybody had eaten. They didn't just nibble and leave it. After people ate their full, the apostles went out and still gathered 12 baskets of leftovers. And those who ate the loaves, there were 5,000 people who ended up being fed that day. So without going into the foreshadowing of the 12 tribes with these baskets, we need to know that when we give, God always ends up giving it back in multiples. It may not be in our own lifetime, and that's what we talked about when I preached 2 weeks ago, that people lived in faith, and maybe those people who lived in faith don't see the rewards of their actions, but we also know that living in faith isn't about us. It's about God's big picture. But even if the reward of my faith and my work doesn't come in my own lifetime, we know that it ends up being worth it. So the lesson here is that God likes to do miracles through people because we are not worthy, we are actually incapable, and it displays his workmanship. Because we know that this has only been done because of God's divine grace and mercy. And I'm going to close with this in terms of expecting God to work. One, I want to encourage us with whatever you're going through. Stop making assumptions in such a way that you underestimate God. There may be areas in our lives where we may have stopped praying. This is something my wife and I went through recently. She told me that there were just parts where she just stopped praying for certain things, only to find out that some of us hadn't. Stop assuming that God stopped working in your life. And you've heard me say this before, where I've begged all of us to feel the weight of the gospel. And as we think about this, you have to wonder if our God was big enough to send his son Jesus to live, to die, and then rise again, conquering sin and the grave. Healing in your life isn't going to be that much of a stretch. Fixing our broken relationships